Good day, grade 11 learners. Welcome to the Life Sciences lesson. My name is Shabnam Sukhnandan. This lesson is brought to you by the Sci-Bono Discovery Center in collaboration with the Gauteng Department of Education. So today, grade 11, we're going to be looking at the biodiversity of plants. Now let us look at what are the different plants categories that we need to know in grade 11. And you find that plants need to be classified according to their structure and characteristics. And the four divisions of plants we're going to be looking at is going to be your bryophyta, your pteridophytes, your gymnosperms, and your angiosperms. You can see it's phyta, bryophytes, and pteridophytes, gymnosperm, and angiosperm. So these are the four categories of plants that we're going to be studying. The bryophytes is actually your mosses, and then you're going to look at a phylogenetic tree, which is very important and it's always tested in the June exam. What is a phylogenetic tree? Remember, the word philo means a group of organisms, and genetic means the genes. What are the characteristic genes that that group of plants has? Specific kind of characteristics. So evolution, what is evolution? It's a gradual change in the genetic information of a plant over time. So it's a gradual process that causes changes in the characteristics of a population across many, many generations. So as we have new generations of plants, little characteristics will change due to what we call genetic changes. And because of the small changes over time, we say there's an evolution of plants. There's a new evolution of plants, like, for example, your cell phones, right? Over time, the cell phones that existed maybe in 2003 and the cell phones that exist now in 2025, you can see that the functioning and the behavior and the characteristics have changed. So that is an evolution of cell phones. Same thing, there's an evolution of plants due to genetic changes over time. And we express this using a phylogenetic tree. Now you can look at it here, learners. Group E is a common ancestor of all the groups. So first we have the ancestral group, which first originated. And then it gave rise to group A and to group D. Then group D gave rise to group B and to group C. And you're going to see that the common ancestor for A, B, C, and D is group E. That is the ancestral group. But now, when you look at the phylogenetic tree, it also tells you the evolutionary relationships between closely related and not so closely related organisms. Now you see, E gave rise to A, but D gave rise to B and C. So B and C will have more characteristics that are closely related because they share a more recent common ancestor, which is D. And this one is not a so recent common ancestor. It is the ancestral one. Now let us look at the lines of the phylogenetic tree. How will you read or interpret the lines of a phylogenetic tree? And as you can see, the phylogenetic tree shows the lines of descent, how we descended from one original species. And you can see that group A, B, and C are all the descendants from common ancestor E. That group E gave rise to group A and D. Okay, E gave rise to A and D. And that D gave rise to B and C. And that B and C are closely related. And that A and C are not so closely related, okay, because A and C don't share a common recent ancestor. So B and C are more closely related than A and E or A and C, okay. So group A and B are not as closely related, group A and B, as group B and C, okay. Now we have some questions that on the phylogenetic tree. Which number represents the common ancestor for all the present day species in the phylogenetic tree? Now you have numbers 1, 2, and 3. And what do those numbers represent, learners? They will represent the common ancestor. And you can see which number represents the common ancestor for all A, B, C, D, and E. That's the present day species. It's going to be 1, isn't it? Because that's 1, and that 1 is giving rise to all the others. So it's 1. What is the common ancestor for species A and B? It's going to be 3. It's going to be 3, because so 3 is a common ancestor for A and B. Well, let's go back again. And what will 2 be? 2 is going to be a common ancestor that gave rise to 3. And 2 gave rise to this common ancestor is not normally labeled here. So C and D are more closely related because they will share this common ancestor. And A and B are more closely related because they share number 3 as a common ancestor. And remember, your ancestor is right at the back, right? It starts off from the back with a 0, and present day comes to the front. This is what is existing present day, and that is your ancestor which may have died out. Right, the same tree, different questions. Is species A more closely related to species B or C? Now look at A and B and C. You can see straight away, A and B has a common link. It's coming from that number 3. So, which one is going to be more closely related? B and C? Or is B and C, or is A closely related to B? Or is A closely related to C? A will be more closely related to B because they share a common ancestor. It's going to be B, okay? Because A and B are sharing the common ancestor, not A and C. Right. Explain your answer in question 3. Species A and B share a more recent common ancestor compared to species A and C. So you don't just say species B and stop. You must explain. And if you do explain, you got to say that species A and B share a more recent common ancestor. And then you don't stop there. You say A and B share a more common recent ancestor compared to species A and C. So in other words, C's common ancestor is not related to A and B's common ancestor. So you got to explain it fully, learners. Now let us look at what is a moss plant. A moss is simply, the green carpet-like structure you see in the shady areas of your school building, near the wall, where you may stand in the shade normally when it's very, very hot. Then you go and seek some shade near the school buildings. Now look at in between the bricks. You'll find this green carpet-like structure. You can actually dig it off. That is called a moss. Okay, they are very, very tiny plants, and under the microscope, it looks the most beautiful. It looks like a huge green forest plantation under the microscope, and you will never believe that those small little fibers are actually like big plants, but in a microscopic state. So we have 3 kinds of plants that belong to bryophytes. We have your mosses, we have your liverworts, and we have your hornworts. Okay, so you can see here's your moss, here's your liverworts because it looks like a liver, and here's your hornworts. So these are the moss, examples of moss, and this is the one that you find mostly common amongst the bricks in a shady building. And they favor shade, and they favor where it's damp. So normally after rains and it's damp and it's moist and warm and moist, but in shady, but towards the bricks where it's dampy, that's where you're going to find the moss. You also find it sometimes around the taps. Where you find the taps, then you find bricks and little plants. You will also find some moss plants near the taps because it's damp and shady, and they will need water for reproduction. So when you look at this moss plant under the microscope, what you see like this, just as something flat and small, is actually going to look like this. This is what it looks like under the microscope. You find a leafy gametophyte, and you find a sporophyte with a sporangium on the top. And if we draw it, you'll see that this looks like this. This is a gametophyte, which contains your gametes, and this gametophyte is haploid. It means it has half the chromosome number, and it has gametes, which is your sperm cells and your egg cells, and they will fertilize and they'll give rise to a zygote, which is diploid, that will give rise to your sporophyte generation. Your sporophyte is the one that produces spores inside this capsule. It's not a real sporangium, so they call it a capsule, and it's normally protected by like a small little hat-like structure, okay? A hat-like structure like that. So you have your sporangium, and then you have like a small hat-like structure, which you call the calyptra. You don't see it here, but that's the calyptra. And then the opening of this sporangium got like teeth-like structures that open like that, okay? Like that. Then here is your, here's it. So here is your sporangium, and this lid-like structure is called your operculum. And it looks like little teeth like all going inside. So it's hygroscopic. It absorbs water, so it closes the capsule. When it's very, very damp, it closes the capsule. Okay, and then it needs wind and dryness, so then it will shrink, and it will release the spores. So here is your sporophyte generation, which has a lid called the calyptra, an opening called the operculum. You can also call the sporangium of the moss a capsule because it's very, very tiny. It is actually anchored onto a little stalk called the seta. It's not a real stem. It's very, very thin, almost hair-like. A stalk called the seta, and unlike the sporangiophore in the bread mold, this is called a seta. And then you're going to have this generation of leaves where one is a male branch and the other one is a female branch. This, we call it the leafy gametophyte because it has leaves, so it can photosynthesize for the moss and produce food for the moss plant to grow. And then this sporophyte here is we call semi-parasitic because it cannot make its own food. So it gets its food from the gametophyte. That's why it's very, very short-lived as well. Okay. So let us look at some of the characteristics of bryophytes. Mosses are generally small, less than 20 centimeters. So it's a very, very small plant found close to the ground. They do not have true roots, stems, and leaves, and therefore the plant body is called a thallus. This word is very important. A plant body that does not have true roots, stems, and leaves, what do we call it? A thallus. Spelling is of utmost importance. What else did you learn about that was a thallus? Yes, the bread mold. The bread mold was a mass of fungal threads, no true roots, stems, and leaves. Even the bread mold was called a thallus. Right. Now, these leaves of the moss, they are very, very simple, learners. They don't really have a cuticle or strengthening tissue or conducting tissue. So water from the air, for example, a drop of water from the rain could be like a big dam for one little leaf. So that water is very important. All the plants cluster together like fibers of a carpet, and they trap any moisture. And we need that moisture for the sperm cell to swim in a small drop of water to the what we call archegonia, which is the female organ inside the female branch. So we need a drop of water here for the female, for the sperm cell to move from the male branch into the female branch. And that's where the zygote is going to be forming. So you have, actually it's going to be the male gamete will swim and go to the archegonia here and undergo fertilization. And then after fertilization, you're going to get a diploid zygote. And that zygote will give rise to your foot, like a foot which is embedded inside the gametophyte generation to absorb water from it. Seta, a thin stalk, and transfers all the food towards the capsule where the diploid spores are located. So water can be absorbed directly through the leaves. They don't have a true root to absorb water. The water is absorbed through the leaves for photosynthesis to make food. Okay. The leaves are not true leaves and are also often referred to as leaflets. Now, another thing, cat learners, is that with the mosses or bryophytes, right, they have a limited size because they don't have xylem and phloem. Do you remember in grade 10, the xylem and the phloem was conducting tissue, and they will conduct water from the root up very, very tall plants. Now, because this plant is very, very small, close to the ground, almost like touching the ground, how can you have a big xylem? So there's no xylem to transport water. There's no phloem because they're so close to the ground that one drop of water or just damp soil, even if the soil is just damp, it's sufficient to be absorbed through the leaves. Okay. So it goes to the leaves, and then the chloroplasts in the green leaves use it to photosynthesize. And then the phloem, the food that is made in the chloroplast, is distributed by simple cells that act as conducting tissue, and they transport the food via simple cells, not phloem, to the chloroplast and to all cells of the leaf and the seta and the zygote and the rhizoids, which are you remember the rhizoids? If you look at it here, these simple little structures here called rhizoids, they anchor the moss into a little soil. There's the rhizoids, and then you have a simple conducting tissue called the stem. It's not made up of xylem and phloem or collenchyma or parenchyma. It's a simple structure referred to as a stem, right? And they are simple cells which will take water from the soil and transport it to the leaves for photosynthesis. And when the leaves or the chloroplast makes food, they will transport the food down the conducting cells, which act as a stem, to the rhizoids. And that's how the moss is existing. Yes. And then you're going to see here, there's no phloem in bryophytes, right? Here is the magnified view of a moss plant, right? It looks so big, but imagine it's like almost like 2 millimeters. 2 millimeters about on the ground. I mean, look at your ruler and look at where it's 2 millimeters. That's how small it is. So it has to be seen under the microscope, right? You can use a hand lens as well, and you can, but the hand lens can magnify it, and you'll be able to see the leafy gametophyte generation, and then you can also see at a later stage the sporophyte generation. So here is the operculum, which is the lid of the sporangium. That's the capsule, that's the seta, that's the leafy gametophyte. That is a simple cells acting as a stem, and simple little cells acting as roots, hair-like structures, which are called rhizoids. So that's the gametophyte generation, and it's always learned as haploid, which means it has half the chromosome number. And then when fertilization occurs, haploid Y, it has gametes. The gametophyte generation comes from the word gametes. So these gametes must always be haploid. They have half the chromosome number. And then when they come together, haploid sperms and haploid ova come together in the gametophyte. They fuse by a process called fertilization, and then they will give rise to this diploid sporophyte generation. This generation here is called diploid. And why is it called sporophyte? It's going to give rise to spores. Why is this one called gametophyte? It has gametes, which in the form of sperm cells and egg cells. Now let's see, how do these moss plants actually reproduce? Bryophytes can reproduce either asexually or sexually. Okay, the plant's life cycle consists of 2 generations. We said it's the dominant. So what do we mean by dominant? When you're looking at a moss plant, the green leaves in between the bricks, what generation is that? You're seeing it all the time, so that is the dominant gametophyte generation. And later, it will give rise to the sporophyte generation, and they will alternate like that. The plant life cycle consists of 2 generations. The gametophyte generation is dominant. We see that all the time. It consists of green leafy plants capable of photosynthesis. Sperm cells and egg cells. Keep note, learners, it's not just sperms and eggs. You have eggs for breakfast. You can't just say sperms. It is a sperm cell because it has a nucleus. So it's a sperm cell, and an egg cell is produced by the male and female reproductive organs in each of the 2 branches. And therefore, because on one plant you have male and female branches, né? It's called monoecious. But when you have a separate male and a separate female, it's called dioecious. Now, let's just look at this. Spores produced in the sporophyte generation, right? Spores are produced in what? So here's the sporophyte. What does it produce? It produces spores like little dust-like structures. And then needs water for reproduction. That is the gametophyte generation. Also, the bryophytes, they don't produce any fruits or seeds. So no fruits and no seeds is produced. It's only spores are produced by this little capsule. Okay. And you must remember, for the spores, which looks like flour or fine pollen dust, it cannot be damp. It doesn't need dampness. So the sporophyte does not need damp situations, because if it's damp, the spores are going to cling together and they won't be dispersed. They'll cling together and they're going to fall near the parent plant. So when the sporangium needs to release the spores, learners, it must be dry. So the sporangium loses water and shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, and then just simply bursts open under pressure, and it releases the spores. And then that spores is needed to be carried and spread by the wind. So sporophyte generation needs dry conditions, whereas the gametophyte generation on the same plant needs water. So on this plant, there's 2 types of reproduction. It is sexual reproduction on the gametophyte generation and asexual reproduction in the sporophyte generation. So this can be questioned. What do we mean by alternation of generation? Okay. Now here's the life cycle where they alternate with each other. So you're going to, let us start off now. We're going to start off by looking at the parent plant, which has a capsule. Now the calyptra becomes dry and it falls off. It exposes the opening with a hygroscopic teeth-like structure, which we call the peristome teeth. Now the peristome teeth is going to be all swollen with water and close it, because when it's not windy, it must close. We don't want to spread the spores in wet conditions. We want spores to be dispersed in dry conditions. So what happens is, when the calyptra is ripe, it will fall off in dry conditions. Then these little teeth here. Here's your operculum. Here's your teeth called the peristome teeth. See, like that. And here's your capsule. Now, all the diploid spores are within that capsule. And then for this diploid spores, they must undergo meiosis to release haploid microspores. Once the spores are undergone meiosis and become haploid, right, they wait for the area to become very, very dry and hot. Once it's dry and hot, these teeth-like structures begin to shrink. When they shrink, they're going to look like this. You see? Now, what happens is that when they shrink, it puts pressure inside this capsule, and the capsule bursts and it splits, and it actually releases a whole lot of spores into the wind, and the wind will carry the spores, which are very, very light, far away from this parent plant. And then that spore, which underwent meiosis, the spore will now fly in the wind, fly, and it will germinate into a leafy gametophyte with 2 branches. a female branch and a male branch. Okay, here they are, male branch and a female branch, which we call the male gametophyte and the female gametophyte on one plant. Right, and then you're going to see that the male part or sperm cell will swim in the water to the female gamete, and then here they're swimming here. Here you can see now that the water is there and your sperm cells have swam, okay, from the andrecium or antheridium to the archegonia. It goes down, and here's your archegonia, which has the egg cell, and then the sperm cell will fuse with the egg cell to form a diploid zygote, okay, which is the embryo, and then that embryo will form a foot, a seta, and a sporangium. It's going to form into a foot, right, a small foot like that, a seta, and a capsule like that. And then after that, you're going to have a small little structure like that called the calyptra. So this is the sporophyte generation, and it is diploid. And this is your leafy gametophyte generation. Okay, that could be the female branch, and that could be the male branch. You see, like that. Here's your male branch. And then obviously you're having your little rhizoids, which absorb water, and your leaves are green for photosynthesis, and that's when fertilization occurs in the archegonia, which is the female structure. Look at this diagram of the moss below and answer the questions that follow, okay? To which division of plants, or to which division does this plant belong? The minute you see this is the leafy gametophyte, and you can see the thin stalk called the seta, and the sporangium gone like a sharp little point called the calyptra, you must know that this plant belongs to the division what? Bryophyta, not moss. Moss is a plant, but the division which it belongs is called the bryophytes. The bryophytes, okay? You can also say bryophyta, it's correct. Why is this plant body called a thallus? Remember what I said, learners? A thallus is when a plant has no true roots, no true stems, and no true leaves. If it doesn't have true roots, stems, and leaves like a normal plant, it is called a thallus, just like the one we've seen in the bread mold. So why is the plant body called a thallus? They do not have true roots, stems, or leaves. Same diagram and different questions, okay? So I just want to have a break. I just want to drink some water. So now we're going to look at the structures that anchor the plant. What are the structures that anchor this little plant? They are called not roots but rhizoids, okay? So structures that act like roots are called rhizoids. Identify the generation labeled A. You can see the sporangium. So it's going to be, what's the generation called? Sporophyte. It comes from the word sporangium. What is the generation B? This leafy one? It's called the gametophyte because it has gametes, sperm cells and egg cells. Sperm cells are in the antheridium and egg cells are in the archegonia. Okay. Why are the moss plants usually found in damp areas? Because they will require water for fertilization. Also, they want water to diffuse through their leaves into the chloroplast for photosynthesis. That is what you learned about damp. Anything that damp has water or moisture. And here's the answer. That mosses do not have conducting tissue. What's conducting tissue? Xylem and phloem. They don't have it. So mosses do not have conducting tissue. And therefore, why must they be found in a damp area? Because the water is absorbed directly through its leaves. Can you see that? Now, moss needs also, why must it be found in a damp area? They need water for fertilization. Sperm cells must swim to the egg cell. So they need water for that. All right, and that is why it's important to grow moss plants in places where water is readily available. Okay. Here's your same 4 groups, learners. Now we're going to move on to pteridophytes. Now what are pteridophytes? So we had fungi, then we had moss, which is green. Remember, fungi looked green, but it's not really green. They don't have chlorophyll. And therefore, they are found on dead food or dead organic food like bread, where they break down the bread and get their nutrition. So that was called what? Saprophytic, whereby they are found on dead decaying organic matter. Saprophytic. Remember, and now moss plants are having chloroplasts. They got leaf-like structures, and therefore they can make their own foods. If they are called bryophytes. Now, pteridophytes, learners, are a little bit of a taller plant. Okay, you all heard of your ferns at home. Your mom must be keeping ferns. All ferns belong to pteridophytes. Now, the division pteridophytes includes all ferns, and then there's 12,000 different species of ferns found on Earth. So no matter what planet you go to, what province you go to, or what forest you go to, when you see a fern, you can only see 4 different types of ferns. Okay? You have ferns, but you have different species of 12,000 different species of ferns. Look at these ferns. Now, all of them are ferns. This one is just one, and all the leaves are like divided. Then you get another one that looks like this. Okay, here's one leaf which is divided into many, many leaflets. And then here's a very, very big leaf which is divided into one leaf, into a leaflet, and then the leaflet is even further divided. So you can see that's one leaf. That leaf is divided into leaflets, and then each leaflet is further divided into smaller leaflets. So children, it looks like this, right? And you have and you have a central part of it here, your stalk, and then you have your leaves, and then the smaller leaves. So you have 12,000 different species of ferns which normally occupy the bed of the forest. Okay, so you have under the canopy of large trees in the forest, these ferns actually maintain the dampness of the soil. So when there isn't rain, at least that water can be conserved in the dry season. These ferns, you are used to trap the water. Ferns range, they are much more taller than moss plants. They are tiny, but they are far more higher. They are taller in height compared to the moss. They are from tiny plants of 1 centimeter in height to tree ferns which can grow to 25 meters in height. Most ferns require a warm, damp, shady habitat, just like the moss. So ferns, unlike moss and unlike bread mold, they have a true root, true stem, and true leaf. So learners, what makes a plant to have a true root, stem, and leaf? It is only called a true root, stem, and leaf if there is xylem and phloem, and also strengthening tissue like sclerenchyma and collenchyma. If the stem and the leaves have those tissues, then it is called a true plant, because it got a true root, stem, and a leaf. Right. Now this structure here is a stem, but this stem of the fern is underground like a ginger. It looks like a ginger. We call this underground stem, which grows horizontally. It grows horizontally like that. We call that the rhizome. So normally, in normal traditional plants, you'll have like your roots, then that's your stem, and then that's your leaves, ne? But in a fern, this is the stem, and this is the roots, and that will be the leaf. That will be the whole leaf. Can you see that? So that's how this fern differs from other plants, that the stem is horizontal and underground, whereas other plants, the stem is vertical and above the ground. Here the stem is horizontal and below the ground. It's also covered by protective scaly leaves, you know, like a ginger, and it also stores food. The rhizome stores food, and here's your leaf that is coming directly from this rhizome. Here's the rhizome, and here's your stem. So this is actually the stalk. This is not a stem. This is the stalk of the leaf. Okay? This is the stalk of the leaf. So normally you have a leaf that looks like this. Here's a leaf. Here's the vein. Now can you see this is a leaf stalk? Here. That's a leaf stalk. So there's the leaf stalk. So it looks like this leaf has been further divided into many small portions. See, it's divided into leaflets. And that is how you can recognize that this is a fern. The one leaf is divided into smaller leaflets. That's how you know that's a fern. This little structure here, which is coiled, is called a frond. This rhizome is giving rise to another small leaf. So a small developing leaf that arises from the rhizome. Here it is like a little fiddlehead. You call it a fiddlehead, okay? It's like coiled. It looks like this. And all the leaves are all coiled in there. This is a small, young, developing fern. It's called a fiddlehead. Right. That's the roots. The ferns have what kind of roots? These are proper roots, which we call adventitious roots. So fern plants have adventitious roots, whereas the bread mold and the moss have rhizoids, not a true root, stem and leaf, and therefore it's called a thallus. But the fern is the first plant or group of plants which have true roots, and the roots are adventitious and they arise from the rhizome. Right. So children, here's the axis, okay, or the stalk of the leaf going into this middle part here. And then you're going to have the pinna, which is your little leaflet. And then you're going to have these smaller leaves that are divided are called pinnules. And then we're going to magnify one leaflet. Here's it. And then from the leaflet, you can see your small little pinnules. And what else can you see from the fern? They all are green, which means they have chloroplasts and they can photosynthesize and make their own food. But if you look at the bread mold was saprophytic. It could not make its own food. It depended on dead, decaying organic food like your bread and your tomato and your cheese. That's bread, that's fungi. Okay, so they are not true roots. Then the moss is not a true plant, it's a thallus, but yet it is autotrophic. It can make its own food. Only the sporophyte one could not make its own food. Only the sporophyte division could not make its own food. So some of the fern's characteristics are the fern leaves are covered by a waxy cuticle. You'll see sometimes learners after a heavy rain, and when the leaves are swaying in the wind, you'll see that the leaves on the top have a shine. It has a gloss. It's not smeared with Vaseline, it has a gloss. This gloss is due to the waxy layer found on top of the leaves. Remember, these plants are standing every day in the sun, right? We stand under the tree to give us shade, but nothing is giving the tree shade. So it's going to be losing a lot of water because the whole day it's standing in the sun. So what mechanism is there to protect these leaves? There's a waxy cuticle that protects the leaves, okay? So leaves are covered by a waxy cuticle to prevent too much of water loss. The leaf of a plant is divided into smaller leaflets called pinnules, right? And that reduces the surface area. It makes the surface area smaller so that the ferns don't lose a lot of water. That's why it's further divided into smaller leaves. And at the back of the leaves, we have small openings called the stomata, which allows carbon dioxide to enter and oxygen to leave after photosynthesis. Stomata are openings which are found on the lower side of the leaves. Now here, children, you can see a xylem tissue. Now xylem is found inside where? It can be found in the stalk. So you can find xylem inside the stalk of this leaf. Here's the stalk. Okay. You can also find xylem and phloem inside the veins of the leaf, which means as long as you see xylem and phloem in the leaves and in the stems, you must know that is a true plant. It's a true plant. Okay. So the presence of vascular tissue. What's a vascular tissue? A vascular tissue is xylem and phloem. So the presence of vascular tissues allows ferns to grow taller than mosses. The fact that ferns have true roots, stems and leaves, they are much more taller than the moss which was close to the ground, because they have both xylem and phloem. Can you see now? The phloem is made by the chloroplast, and then the food is transported down the phloem tissue to your roots. Now, what are some of the characteristics of the fern? The stems of most ferns grow horizontally. Can you see? Underground like this. That's horizontal, where you lie flat, and vertical way is when it's upright. But the stem of the fern is horizontal. It's called a rhizome. Rhizomes are protected by brown scaly leaves, like the leaves of an onion. Okay, same thing. The rhizome is protected by the brown scaly leaves, so it doesn't lose too much of water. The rhizome cuts down on water loss by being underground. Okay, that's one. And it is covered by small brown leaves. So why must you have small leaves to cover that rhizome? So that it doesn't lose too much of water, especially when there's a fire. The brown leaves can get burnt, and the rhizome is protected from losing all the food that is stored in it. Okay. What are the type of roots in a fern? The fern has what we call adventitious roots. These are true roots, and they come from the nodes of the rhizome. So here's the rhizome, and here's the nodes and internodes, and from the nodes comes your adventitious roots. These are true roots because they have xylem and phloem, and they can absorb water for the plants. The roots also anchor the plant in the soil. So this plant can stand on its own because it has its own true roots, stems and leaves, and can make its own food as well. Okay. Now we're going to look at what we call asexual reproduction. So learners, I don't know if you have ferns at school or at home, or you can ask your mom, Mom, do you have a fern plant? And you'll see that the fern plants are shorter, and that each leaf is divided into smaller leaflets. Okay. Now they reproduce both sexually and asexually, the fern plants, okay? The dominant generation in the fern is a sporophyte generation. Now learners, do you remember the moss had rhizoids? It had a thin stalk-like structure. It had like a capsule with the operculum and a calyptra which covers the opening of the sporangium. But now, let's look at this back of the fern leaf. At the back of the fern leaf, see, the ferns are all facing the direction of the sun. But if you see at the back, now this is an example of the back of the fern leaf. You'll see small like black dots. That is called a sorus. One sorus, and many sori. But sori is spelled like that. So at the back of one leaflet or pinule, there are small structures which we call the sorus. The sorus of the fern is belonging to the sporophyte generation. It's the diploid generation. It's going to produce spores undergoing microspore mother cells which undergo meiosis to produce haploid spores. Okay, so this is called the sporophyte generation. And in the windy conditions, you find they will release what? All the spores. So ferns reproduce sexually. That is in the sorus of the fern. Okay, sorry, sexually and asexually. Asexually means no gametes are involved. It's only spores that are released, right? This is the dominant generation, is what the generation that you see. It is called the sporophyte generation. spores are produced in the sporangia, arranged in the sorus under the leaf. So these dots here are called the sorus. Here's one sorus. And underneath that sorus is going to be a sporangium. So you're going to see now. Plus ferns don't produce any fruits or seeds. Now what is this? Here is your fern plant. I'm sure you can recognize that this is a fern. Here's your rhizome with your adventitious roots. Okay, now in this fern plant, what's going to happen first? Why is this a sporified generation? At the back there are sporangium, which is diploid. So this is the diploid sporified generation. When you're looking at a fern, you see this. And what you see is a dominant generation. When you're looking at the moss between the bricks, that's the gametophyte generation. Leafy gametophyte, it's dominant. Because when you're looking at the moss, you're seeing the leafy dominant generation. Later comes the sporophyte. But with the moss, with the fern, the generation that's dominant is going to be the sporophyte generation. With the moss, the generation that is dominant is going to be the gametophyte generation, which is leafy, né? Right, so learners, let us see this fern nicely. So here you have your sporophyte. Let's start off with the sporophyte generation. This sporophyte generation has a sporangium at the back of the leaves in the sorus. During dry weather, sporangium bursts, undergoes meiosis, and then it gives rise to haploid spores. The spores actually fall on the ground in a damp place, and they give rise to a heart-like structure called the prothallus. Right. So now in this heart-shaped structure called the prothallus, at the back of it, you find there is what we have, your archegonia, and you have an antheridia. So you have an archegonia and you have an antheridia. Here is your archegonia, which is the female part with the egg, and there's your antheridia, which is the male part with the sperm cells. Now they are found on the inside this prothallus. Okay. So you'll say now, where did the prothallus come from? When spores are released from this leafy sporophyte generation, it's the dominant one. It's what you see. There is the sorus. In the sorus, there are sporangium. Sporangiums are diploid. They're diploid. Okay. Now they must undergo what? They must undergo meiosis to produce haploid spores. When the haploid spores are released, by the sporangium, it will go and land on a suitable site, like a damp place under the tree. So this haploid spores will give rise to what? A gametophyte generation, which is leafy. The leafy gametophyte generation now will become a zygote, right? And it's going to have leaves, and the leaves is going to be sporangia. The sporangia are going to divide by meiosis to form spores. The spores land on the ground, and then that spore that lands on the ground is going to form a heart-shaped structure called the prothallus. This prothallus now, you see it has a heart-shaped structure like that, which is called a prothallus. So the spore released from the sporangium, spore released by the sporangium, develops into a heart-shaped prothallus. Now in this prothallus, learners, you find there are little structures here like this called rhizoids, hair-like structures called rhizoids. Amongst the rhizoids now, there is water from the soil. There's water. And then you're going to have your sperm cells, okay? You're going to have your sperm cells, and they're going to produce sperm cells inside this structure called the antheridia. And then near this notch, this is called a notch. This is the notch. You're going to have your female egg cells like that. Okay, this is called the archegonia with an egg cell. Now, when there's water, what happens is that the sperm cells from this antheridia will swim in the drop of water to the egg cell inside that archegonium. And the diploid zygote is formed, which will give rise to what? Your fern plant. So here is what we call an alternation of generation. The dominant generation, what you see with your naked eye, the fern, it's called the sporophyte generation. It's dominant, but it's short-lived. It's dominant but short-lived, okay? Yes. So here's your sporophyte generation. It gives rise to your leafy gametophyte. It gives rise to your prothallus, which is a gametophyte. Gametophyte needs water for sexual reproduction, whereas the sporophyte generation needs wind to release the spores. And you can see there's an alternation of generation. So learners, please, what you need to do is a comparative table. So you make a comparative table like this, right? And you're going to put here moss, and you're going to put fern, then you're going to put dominant generation. In the moss, it's the gametophyte. In the fern, it's the sporophyte. Is there alternation of generation? Yes, yes. Okay. What is the sporophyte generation in the moss? It's a foot seta and a capsule. What is the sporophyte generation in the ferns? It is the sorus underneath the leaves. So these sorus underneath the leaves is the sporophyte generation. But because it's the leafy generation, it becomes the dominant sporophyte generation. And when the spores land on the ground, it gives rise to the heart-shaped prothallus. This is the gametophyte generation. Okay. Now let's look at the questions based on the alternation of generation. Give the letter of the structure representing the gametophyte. So can this A be the gametophyte? No, because it has spores inside the sporangium at the back of the leaves in the sorus. So that is not a sporophyte generation we see. The dominant generation is a sporophyte generation, right? Therefore, this is not the gametophyte, it's a sporophyte. So give the letter of the structure representing the gametophyte. Now you must remember, learners, that from the sporophyte they produce spores. The spores will fall onto the ground and germinate to form a haploid prothallus. This prothallus got what? Gametes in the archegonia and antheridia. Therefore, the spores which will germinate, or haploid spores germinate into a haploid prothallus. The prothallus will have what? Male sperms and female egg cells. So it's representing what generation? The gametophyte. So this is actually your prothallus. And these are what? Your spores. And it is your spores that give rise to your prothallus. Identify structure C and state the name of the structure in which it is found on the leaflets. What is structure C? It's your spores, and they are found in the sorus underneath the leaves. Okay. Identify structure D. What is D? It is the adventitious roots. Remember, the fern comes from a rhizome, which gives rise to adventitious roots. Right. Right? Over there. So identify structure D. That is your adventitious roots. Name two functions of structure D. What are roots there for? To absorb water and to anchor the plant into the ground. It anchors the plant and it absorbs water. Why do we need water? For photosynthesis. Give a name for this type of diagram. This is a diagram with a common ancestor and branches to give rise to more plants over generations. So this one is called what? A phylogenetic tree. Or a smaller phylogenetic tree is called a cladogram, where you have the phylogenetic tree becoming very extensive, like a tree with many, like a common ancestor with this two and this two and then this two, many, many branches. That's a phylogenetic tree. But when you just see one simple one like this, it can be regarded as a cladogram. Right. Which plant division developed first? Let's see now. Here you have a common green ancestral algae. Then you had bryophytes, which is your moss. Then the moss plants gave rise to plants which had xylem and phloem. They were vascular. And then they gave rise to the plants which are called your pteridophytes. So which plant division developed first? It was your algae. Okay. You see, yeah, they're saying bryophytes, but if you look at this diagram, learners, which plant division developed first from your ancestor? It is called your bryophytes. Okay, so you see, the common ancestor is the algae, but the algae gave rise to which plant division first? The first branch is your bryophyte, which is your mosses. Name the common ancestor for pteridophytes and bryophytes. The common ancestor for pteridophytes and bryophytes is what? The ancestral algae. You see, the common green algae which you find on water, right? Which plant is called a thallus and why? Now, we can't talk about this one is the ancestor. Which plant is called a thallus and why? Pteridophytes are not a thallus. That's a true plant because it has xylem and phloem and strengthening tissue. But remember the moss? It was a thallus. Why? It does not have true root, stems and leaves. So why is this plant here? That is the fern called which plant is called a thallus between these two? It's the bryophytes because they don't have true root, stems and leaves. Explain why pteridophytes can grow taller than bryophytes. It's because pteridophytes, which are ferns, are taller and they have xylem and they have phloem. And because they're taller, water has to go from the ground to the taller branches. Whereas the moss, they did not need true root, stems and leaves because they're very close to the ground where all the water is. Water is not traveling up great heights. Therefore, mosses are regarded as a thallus. Whereas ferns, because they are plants above the ground and have a true stem, true leaf and true root, it's called a true plant. Name two similarities between pteridophytes and bryophytes. Pteridophytes, right, and bryophytes, what are two similarities between them? Both are able to photosynthesize. Remember, both can photosynthesize. Therefore, both of them need water for fertilization. Both produce spores. They do not produce fruits. Both are seedless, and you must add that both are autotrophic. They are autotrophic because they can photosynthesize. So moss plants and fern plants, although moss is more of a simple plant, it can photosynthesize just like your fern plant. They are green. They are autotrophic. They are green. That's one similarity. And both of them need water for fertilization. You remember in your moss, your leafy female branch and your leafy male branch, the sperm cell had to swim from the male branch to the female branch. It needed water for fertilization, sexual reproduction. So both need water. Both of them produce spores, whereby the moss has one plant, one sporangium, whereas in a fern, one plant, many sorus at the back, and under one sorus there can be 10 sporangia. So there's much more sporangia in a fern compared to a moss. Okay, but the thing is, although ferns have more sporangia and one moss has one sporangium, both of them produce spores. That is what's common. Both produce spores. Both produce water for fertilization. Both have chloroplasts for photosynthesis, and they do not produce any fruit. So you can't get a seed from a fern and a seed from a moss. Okay, so they do not produce fruits, and therefore they are not they are seedless. Both are seedless. There's no fruit, there's no seeds. Okay. Same division of plants now. We finish with the bryophytes, we finish with the pteridophytes. Now we're going to go to the gymnosperm. So learners, what division of plants belong to gymnosperms? You find your pine trees are actually your gymnosperms. So your common pine trees, where you get your pine gels from, that is your gymnosperm. Where you get your cones from, your little cones, that's a gymnosperm. So it's a pine tree. Okay. Here are your cycads, which is a form of a gymnosperm. Here's your cycads with your cones. There's another group of plants like this, which also produce cones, right? And here you have another part, another actual gymnosperm, and you find you can see your cones. So gymnosperms are cone-bearing plants, and they are regarded as a sporophyte generation. So when you're looking at a cycad or a pine tree, remember you are looking at a sporophyte generation, and it's dominant, and they are able to make food and medicine for people as well. So here's your gymnosperm, and they're going to produce seeds, okay, not spores, but they're going to produce seeds. So here's your cones here. These are actually cones that are hanging down. So these are going to be male cones, where they're going to produce a lot of spores, so that when the spores are released, they will fall down, okay? They hang down, so they will fall down, and they will go to the female cones. All right. So let us look at the pine tree, which is the gymnosperm. Let us understand it. The sporophyte generation is dominant. So between bread mold, there's no real generation. Moss, there is 2 generations. Leafy gametophyte, right, and your sporophyte generation in moss. In your ferns, which is your pteridophytes, your sporophyte generation is going to be the dominant one. Okay, and your protellus, which develops from the spore, it's short-lived. It lasts just for a while until sexual reproduction takes place, and then it disappears. So in your mosses, you find that there's no alternation of generation. There is alternation of generation. In your ferns, there's alternation of generation. And in your pine trees, there is also an alternation of generation. But in gymnosperms or in pine trees, it is the sporophyte that is dominant. So both pine trees, which is gymnosperms, and mosses, which is bryophytes, the sporophyte generation is dominant, okay? Right. The leaves of the pine trees, now children, the leaves of pine trees, you must make a table. As I say, you have to make a comparative table, learners. You have to make a comparative table, and you have to compare all the criteria. Like what? For example, now you'll put here bread mold, then you'll put moss, then you'll put ferns, then you're going to put, for example, pine trees, okay? Then you'll put division, then you'll put, for example, bread mold, it's a fungus. It's a fungus, mycophyta, né? Fungus. And then this one here is going to be your moss, bryophyta. Ferns is going to be your pteridophyta. Pine trees is going to be your gymnosperms. And then we're going to go to your flowering plant, which is going to be your angiosperms. So you need to draw little pictures of each one. Little picture of a bread mold, little picture of a moss, a picture of a fern, a picture of a pine tree, a picture of a flowering plant, so that you know exactly that these are the plants and these are the divisions, and is there an alternation of generation, which generation is dominant, which one requires water, which one requires wind for spore dispersal. How does the sporangium of a moss differ from the sporangium of a fern, right? If gymnosperms produce spores, where are the spores coming from? They are coming from the male cones. So here you can see this picture of the pine tree, and you find that male cones grow in clusters. They are very, very tiny, and they grow in clusters, and they hang down. So when the wind sways the branches, you find the male cones simply shake, and they dust off the pollen. So the pollen are called microspores. And this pollen now will go fly, and it will land on the female cone with the ovule. All right. So therefore you find in a pine tree, the male cones are always found on the upper branches, and the female cones are always found on the lower branches of a pine tree. Why is that important? Why is the location of cones so important in a pine tree? Imagine if the female cone was on the upper branches and the male cone was on the lower branches. the spores will never reach the female cone. Remember, it's always the female gamete that moves to the male gamete. So, it's already the male gamete that moves to the female gamete. It's always the sperm cells or the spores that must move to the female ovule or female gamete. And therefore, if the male cones were at the bottom, then the female ovule will never be fertilized. So that is one question that will come out, okay? You find the leaves are very, very narrow-like. They are needle-like. So why must pine trees be needle-like? Remember, pine trees normally grow in wintry areas where there's lots of snow. So if the leaves were thin and flat, like the normal leaves we find in your garden, right? And if it snows, the snow will actually freeze the leaf and stay on the leaf and kill the leaf. So if the leaves of a tree are dead, they won't photosynthesize, they won't be able to make food and transport food to all parts of the plant. So therefore, where there are pine trees, it's always snowing, and when the snow actually is trapped, like in Christmas time, you find all your Christmas trees. What kind of trees are represented by as Christmas trees? It is the pine trees with all those little needle-like leaves. So when the snow falls, it will fall between the leaves. It doesn't stay on the leaves. It simply falls off the leaves. A little bit will stay, but most of it will fall down, 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 and go into the branches and then go to the ground. And you can see the way the pine tree is shaped. Can you see it? The pine tree is shaped like a triangle, so that the snow can fall, and go onto the lower, older branches of the tree. The older branches are more dead. The younger branches are very much alive. So when the snow falls to the needle-like leaves, which are very short on the top, and then falls down and settles onto the lower branches. Also, you find your clusters of male cones are going to be on the top, and you find your female cone, which is much bigger, is going to be at the bottom, so that the pollen from the male cone can fall onto the ovule of the female cone. Therefore, the positioning of the cones are important. Also, the structure of the cones. Male cones are small. Female cones are large. Male cones are found in clusters. Female cones are found singly. Male cones are found on the upper branches of the pine tree. Female cones are found on the lower branches of the pine tree. You find when you're looking at a pine tree, it's the dominant sporophyte generation because it got cones with spores. Therefore, the pine tree is a dominant sporophyte generation. Okay? And then it needs wind for dispersal. The pine tree needs wind for dispersal. So when it's windy and the tree sways, then the pollen sacs burst open and they dust off large amounts of pollen. That's when people get the allergies. They say there's too much of pollen in the air. Where's that pollen coming from? It's coming from your pine trees, and they have to produce large amounts of pollen. So although producing large amounts of pollen can be a wasteful process, it's very important, because if you produce little pollen, we may not be aware that there may not be a success rate of fertilization. That means the success rate of fertilization is going to be lowered, because if it's a little, some pollen may fly off and go onto the ground, it may wash off into the rivers, right? It may just get lost into the wind, and some will never ever reach the female cone. So therefore, if they're produced in copious amounts, large amounts, at least some pollen is going to land on the female cone with the ovule, and this increases the chances of fertilization. A very important question that can be asked in the exams. Okay, so now pine trees cannot have a simple root system or like rhizoids, because they are very, very tall and they need deep anchorage and they need much more water, because they are taller trees, taller than 25 centimeters, very, very tall, tapering over 2 to 3 meters high. Okay, so pine trees are very, very tall. Therefore, they have vascular tissue. They have true leaves, true stems and true roots. The root system in a pine tree is called the adventitious root system. You can see smaller branches on the top and larger branches at the bottom for the snow to fall through, and also for the pollen to fall through. They're needle-like so that the pollen doesn't sit on broad leaves like that. It's needle-like so that the pollen can fall through the needles, right, to the pine cone, to the female cone at the bottom. Therefore, the leaves of a pine tree are structurally suited for its function. It's needle-like to reduce the surface area so that there's less water is lost. That's why it's needle-like, okay? It has a thick waxy cuticle to prevent water loss. Also, the needle-like leaves ensure that trapped snow will not collect but fall to the ground. Also, the needle-like leaves allows the pollen grains to move through them and to land onto the ovule of the female cone. The pine tree has an extensive branching adventitious root to absorb every little water available for photosynthesis. Pine trees are not just found in Africa, so they're not indigenous to South Africa. Pine trees are found in many, many other countries. So you find it's not indigenous where you can say, no, only pine trees are found in South Africa. It's only the protea that's indigenous, but pine trees are found worldwide. Okay. Now, this is the structure of the cones. So, gymnosperms are cone-bearing. They bear cones, not flowers and fruits. They bear cones, okay, and seeds. That's why it's gymnosperms. The fact that they say sperms means it's not a sperm cell, no. It simply means it's seed-bearing. It bears seeds. So, gymnosperms do not produce flowers. They produce what? Male and female cones. The male cones are in clusters. They're smaller and they carry pollen grains. The female cones are larger and they're woody. So if you are, for example, camping in the forest with a caravan and you want to make a little fire to make your tea, not a huge fire to set the forest on fire. If you just want to make a little fire just to cook some food or to have some tea, you can put little bricks or stones, and then you want little wood. Now you can't find the wood, you don't want to break the branches of the tree. You find once fertilization occurs on this female cone, now the ovules are set free. The cone has no longer a function. The cones will simply fall to the ground. And then you can use those woody cones to light a small little fire, okay? So female cones are larger. You can see it's large, it's single, and they occur singly, okay? And on the scales now, this is called the ovuliferous scales. These are called ovuliferous scales. When the ovule is there, the leaves of these are all like leaves. These are actually like woody leaves. They all like seal up because they protect the ovule. As soon as the male cones are ripe and it divides undergoes meiosis and the male cone is ripe and ready to release the pollen, that's when the female cone will open up and expose the ovule which is found on the top. So it's going to look like this. This is an ovuliferous scale and you find an ovule on the top. So here's your central axis of your female cone, and here's all your ovules on the top. And then the male the pollen grains from the male cones will come and fall onto the ovuliferous scales for fertilization. Okay, so pine trees are monoecious. They carry both male and female cones on the same tree. So monoecious means on one tree there are male and female parts. Okay, dioecious means when this tree has only female cones and this tree has only male cones, then we say that that is dioecious. That means when male and female cones are carried on different plants. So this is a pine tree only with male cones. This is the pine tree only with female cones. So you have different species of pine trees. Some are dioecious, where you have separate male trees and separate female trees. And when they're monoecious on one tree, there's male cones and there's female cones. So remember, monoecious means one one tree, but both male and female cones. Dioecious means two trees because separate males and separate females. This is the longitudinal section. If you cut a female cone open, then this is exactly how it looks like when the ovules are still not yet ripe. You can see the leaves are very close, they're not yet open. These ovuliferous scales, which are woody, they're enclosing these ovules which are sitting on top of them, like that. And this one here now, this is actually an example of a male cone. These are your male cones here. Here's your male cones here. These are your female cones. You can see that's one male cone. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There's 11 male cones in a cluster. And this is one single female cone. You can see it's found on the lower branches, and these are found on the upper branches. Now, if you look at the pollen sacs on this male cone here, when they burst, they will burst and they will release the pollen, and each pollen grain now has like two air sacs that look like that. And inside this pollen grain, there are two little male gametes. So these are your male gametes and these are your air sacs. So these pollen grains can actually twirl and twirl and twirl in the wind and move down until they reach the female cones. So here is the pollen grain with your two air sacs, and inside the pollen grain there's two male gametes, and in here there's an ovule with on the female cone there's an ovule with a female gamete. So where are the female spores in the gymnosperms? It's actually not a female spore, it's a female cone. So you find that inside the female cones, right? Where are the female cones? They're found at the bottom. And then where are the, not female spores, but where are the female ovules? Where are the female ovules in gymnosperms? The female ovule is found on top of the ovuliferous scale. And when the pollen lands onto the ovule and fertilizes the female gamete, that ovule now becomes a seed. And then the seed will be released during the wind when the shakes. It will be released and it falls further away from the parent plant, and it forms a new diploid sporophyte pine tree. So the seeds will actually be formed from fertilized ovules. That means the male gamete and female gamete fuse to form a zygote inside this ovule. When the ovule is fertilized, it forms a seed, and then the seed will fall onto the ground and germinate to form a new diploid sporophyte plant, which is your pine tree. As your pine tree grows, it will form cones, male cones on the top, female cones at the bottom, and therefore you find that the male and the female cones are found in one tree. That's monoecious. And the pine tree on its own is a sporophyte generation. That's the dominant generation. So it's only in mosses that the gametophyte leafy generation is dominant. Ferns, that is in the moss, okay? Then in the fern, it is the sporophyte generation that's dominant. In the pine, it's the sporophyte generation that's dominant. In flowering plants, you will see next week, it's going to be the flowering plant that's going to be the sporophyte generation that is dominant. Now let us look at reproduction inside the pine tree. It's important to know that fertilization is not dependent on water. Can you see? We never speak about water. The pollen grains dependent on wind and dry conditions. That's why pine trees look very green, and they sway during September, October. They must sway in the wind, because when the rainy seasons come, by that time the seeds must already be on the ground. So the rains come in October, November, those seeds can germinate to form new trees, and you'll have beautiful Christmas trees or pine trees in December, because now the seeds have germinated. So you see, pollen grains depend on dry conditions, and the pollen is transferred by the wind onto the female ovule. So there's no need for water for fertilization in pine trees. We only need water for the moss plant and for the pteridophyte, the fern plant, but not water for fertilization in the pine tree. Pollen is carried by the wind from a male cone to the female cone. After fertilization, the ovules become seeds. The seeds contain the embryo, and the embryo or the seed will germinate into the new pine tree, which is the sporophyte generation. The seeds of the pine are said to be naked because they are protected by a fruit. Okay, so now, children, you find that that ovule, right, becomes a seed, but nothing protects the seed. They just simply falls down. Now, normally when you are eating a fruit, you find the seeds are inside the fruit. Here, there's no fruit. Okay, because there's no fruit, that's why they say it's naked, because they are not protected by a fruit. If you take an orange or a fruit, you know this, you have to eat the fruit, the fleshy part, to get to the seed. But here there's no fruits. It's just that the ovule is fertilized and they fall down, and just the seed. So the seeds are naked, they're exposed, because there's no one to plant it, there's no one to eat it, so they might just fall into the ground and germinate. Okay, the seeds are carried on the exposed scales of the female cone. So here is the female cone. You can see it's large. You can see how the ovuliferous scales are arranged, like, you know, in a spiral. So it's easy for the pollen grains to simply fall onto these ovules, right? And you can see that this cone becomes very woody once the ovules are fertilized. Then it becomes a seed. The seeds will fall down, right? You find that once the ovules are fertilized, the female cone will actually hang down. So a female cone that is not fertilized will always be like that. But the minute the female cone, the pollen has landed on it and the ovules are fertilized, the female cone will open up and hang down. And that's when you know fertilization took place. And it's easy for the ovules to actually fall down. There is actually the seed of a pine tree. You can see it has like a wing. So where pollen grains have air sacs, these seeds have like a wing. And these wings will spiral, these wings will spiral in the wind so that they can fall further away from the plant, from the parent tree. Why mustn't all the seeds fall next or right underneath the parent tree? If all the seeds germinate right under the parent tree, they're going to compete for water, for light. Then they're not going to germinate and they're going to die. Maybe one or two will survive. But if the seeds are going to be in a spiral, they will actually spiral and fall further away from the parent tree, further away, so we can have a wide spread of pine trees. Okay, so each seed has a wing to help the wind dispersal. It is important for survival of the species that the seed does not fall under the tree. If it germinates under the mother tree or parent tree, it will be in the shade and in competition with the mother tree for water and nutrients. So we don't want it to be in the shade. It needs light, and it also needs water, and it also needs space for the roots to actually develop. Okay, so commercial use of pine trees. Pine trees, you know, you may have pine gel. At home, your mom may be using the green pine gel as a disinfectant or to wipe the surfaces of the floors and things like that. So all this pine gel comes from the resin found from the cones of the pine tree. So once the ovules have been fertilized, right, these cones open up. And you know, remember it was sealed. Before it was fertilized, the cones were sealed. Then when they open, all that little glue-like structure that comes out, it's called resin. And from that resin, they make pine gel. Okay, so pine trees are commercially very important. They are cultivated in South Africa in huge plantations, but then remember, they have to remove your natural forests and trees just to plant your pine trees. That's why it's called commercial plantations. Pine nuts are the seeds of pine trees. Many people use the pine nuts in your baking and cooking. Okay, those pine nuts, they're small little things. They look like sunflower seeds. And you can see a picture of the pine nuts. All right, they use them normally in baking and obviously in your desserts as well, right? They're coming from the pine trees. They're used to flavor drinks and to make basil pesto as well. So you're making pesto and you put them on the pizzas. They all come from the pine trees. Tabulate the following characteristics of gymnosperms in terms of structure, dominant generation, vascular tissue, spores, fruit bearing, dependence, water for reproduction. So learners, this is the kind of table I'm talking about that you must have, right? You must put here, for example, and this is now just for gymnosperms, but you can do this for each division, for bryophytes, for pteridophytes, for gymnosperms, for angiosperms. You look at it and say, okay, which one is the dominant generation? It's a sporophyte. What is it made up of? True roots, stems, and leaves. Why? It has conducting tissue, vascular tissue, strengthening tissue. Vascular tissue, yes, it possesses xylem and phloem. Seeds, it produces, does it produce seeds or spores? It produces spores. It also produces seeds. The seeds are naked. Fruit bearing, no fruit bearing. Dependency on water for reproduction, no. What does it depend on for reproduction? Wind. So you see, you can actually classify this and make your understanding of this plant very easy, and it's easy to distinguish all the characteristics when you are studying. If you look at this activity here, this is what diagram? Phylogenetic tree. Which plant group is the least suited for life on land? Which one will be least suited for life on land? It's going to be the algae, because algae depends on water. So let us see. This is the phylogenetic tree, and the one that's least suited for life on land will be your bryophytes and also your ancestral algae. Why your bryophytes first? Because they need water. So it's least suited for life on land. Land means very, very dry conditions. But what does the bryophyte or the moss need? It needs some water for dependency for fertilization. Okay, so your algae is always found in water. That's why from your algae, the first plant that will depend a little bit on water will be your bryophyte. But your pteridophyte also depends on water for fertilization. But remember, higher up, your gymnosperms and your angiosperms are truly terrestrial plants. They can survive only on land because they don't need water for reproduction. It's only your bryophytes that are totally more dependent on water in a damp area, right, compared to just dry land, because remember, they got no cuticle, so they have to keep as much water as possible. Therefore, bryophytes or mosses are more suitable to living in a damp area or moist conditions than a completely dry area. The same diagram, give a reason for your answer in question 2, and question 2 was, why is the bryophytes or moss least suited for life on land? Why? Bryophytes do not have roots to obtain water for the soil. They don't have vascular tissue to transport water. So they need to remain close to the water in the ground to damp soil to obtain water, and they need water for fertilization. So they need water and dampness for fertilization, whereas your gymnosperms don't. So gymnosperms are truly land plants, terrestrial plants, whereas the bryophytes and pteridophytes are not fully suited to just live on land or dry land. It has to have some form of water. Gymnosperms are more advanced than bryophytes. That means your pine trees are more advanced than your moss plants that grow near the bricks. State 2 pieces from the diagram that supports the statement. So what are the things that make your gymnosperms to be far more advanced than your bryophytes? See, that's your bryophytes. The algae gave rise to bryophytes. But now for gymnosperms to form, there was an evolution, there was a change, there was a process. There was the development of vascular tissue, and there was the development of seeds and less dependence on water. So the development of vascular tissue and seeds were the two things that made the gymnosperms more advanced. Right. And the last question here, children, is a flow diagram. And this flow diagram shows the life cycle of any plant division. And let's see, complete the missing terms in the diagram. What will 1 be? 1 will actually be what? Multicellular gametophyte generation. So that's a gametophyte. How will you know that that is a gametophyte? The fact that they say that this one is going to give rise to two, and there's fertilization, it means for fertilization, two has to be a gamete. So if that's a gamete that comes together for fertilization, this can't be a sporophyte. It has to be a multicellular gametophyte generation, which produces, number two is gametes. They come together for fertilization. Then they form a diploid zygote, which is 3. And the zygote is going to give rise to what? A multicellular sporophyte generation. And the sporophyte generation undergoes meiosis to give rise to spores. And that's how you're going to work it out. So, number 3 is going to be what? A zygote. So, a multicellular gametophyte generation will give rise to what? It's going to give rise to a zygote. The zygote will undergo fertilization, right, to produce what is it? It's going to undergo, the multicellular, learners. Multicellular gametophyte generation is going to produce gametes. It's going to produce gametes. The gametes will come together for fertilization. Then from fertilization, you're going to form a zygote. That's why number 3 is a zygote. And the zygote is going to develop to form a sporophyte generation. And the sporophyte generation is going to undergo meiosis, makes the chromosomes halve to produce spores. The spores will develop into the spores are haploid, which means small letter n, right, half the chromosome number to form a gametophyte. So this is the life cycle of a plant division. And this one is which one? Which plant division is showing this? This is an example of your bryophyta, where you have your multicellular gametophyte, which is your leafy gametophyte. They produce gametes, they swim together, they join together by fertilization. They produce the diploid zygote, which develops the foot seta sporangium. Then the sporangium undergoes meiosis to form haploid spores. The spores are released and a new moss plant grows. So this is a life cycle of your moss plant, which belongs to your bryophyta. And your bryophyta depends on water. Okay, so that is it for today's lesson, learners. And you can see here, okay, number 4 is your sporophyte generation, which process in plant cells will increase and decrease the chromosome number. What increases the chromosome number? It is fertilization. Always remember, sperm cell with its chromosomes, the egg cell with its chromosomes come together, 1 plus 1 come together, giving you 2. So that zygote is always a diploid. It's diploid, double the number of chromosomes. So the process in plant cells which will increase chromosome number, you read it like this: process in plant cells. Okay? Your process in plant cells. Which will increase chromosome number. It's fertilization. Process in plant cells which will decrease chromosome number, and that's going to be meiosis. Meiosis always half the chromosome number, and fertilization always doubles the chromosome number. And that's it for today, learners. Until next week when we do angiosperms, please have your comparative tables and all your criteria, your dominant generation, dependence on water, which is the dominant generation. Is it seed bearing? Is it spore bearing? Is it monoecious? Is it dioecious? Which is the gametophyte? Which is the sporophyte? Are they autotrophic? Are they saprophytic? These are the things that you need to know in plant biodiversity. Have a wonderful day, learners, and keep studying and you'll do well. Thank you.